These are the final exam photographs for one particular semester at SC Photo. And what we're going to do is take a little bit of time and look at these pictures and see what we can tell and see if there's anything that we might want to improve on them. So first of all, as you look at all these pictures, what you're looking for in an ideal, perfect picture is something that looks good on the wall, something that is going to attract your attention. So as you look through them yourself, see if there are particular ones that as you're scanning through them, something in that picture captures your eye, causes you to stop, to ponder, and to look for a second. That's the ideal photograph, one that has something in it that catches your eye. Then next you're looking at is what catches your eye. Is that interesting? Is the picture overall interesting? Did the photographer share a feeling or give you an idea of what a place is like or a part of time is like? Was there an emotion attached to it in some way? Is it cold or is it warm? So you're looking at the pictures, and because this is art, each one of us has our own interest. So if you're looking at this in a school or in your classroom, you might pause the tape at this point and see if you can discuss in the class which pictures they think are the best. And see if looking at this whole collection of them, if there's one that you just like the most, what would you pick? And don't look at this as winners or losers, because these are all great photographs. None of these are snapshots. All of these are well-planned, well-thought-out photographs. Some of them are more interesting than others. Each photographer had some particular emotional reason for why they decided to take this picture. So with that in mind, let's begin to look at each one of these and see whether there's something we could make different about them. So this is an artsy photograph. The photographer has removed the color saturation from the colors of everything except the red portions of the leaf. And so because of that contrast, our eye is always attracted to contrast. So because of that contrast, there's a strong draw to this upper part of the photograph. I like this image. It's one of the ones when you looked at the whole list that attracted your eye, because of that strong pull that's there. The converging lines from the low camera angle really draw your eye up into the photograph. There's not a lot that I would change on this. So one of the things we're looking at, though, is the exposure. So the exposure is found up here in the histogram. The left-hand side are the shadows and the blacks, and the right-hand side are the whites, and of course the middle is the middle tones. So as we're looking at this picture, let's blow it up a little bit. One of the things I notice in it is it has a lot of noise, and noise are these little grainy things that are up here in the top. And for an artistic picture, that's great, no particular problem. I personally don't have a problem with that grain because my background is as a photojournalist, and it was more important to get the picture than to have a picture perfectly sharp and clear. But in my educational experience, I had a class with Ansel Adams, and of course he was all about sharp. And so it changed my viewpoint on things, which is more important, sharp or getting the picture. So in this case, it's a very nice artistic photograph. I like this one. So is there anything that I might want to change? Well, I'm going to look through it and see if they're changing the exposure any. So these are my controls. If changing the exposure any, because right now it appears to be slightly overexposed, does that make any difference on the image? And I'm afraid as I put it down, it loses quite a bit of the feel for the picture. So I'm going to put it back. There's no reason to add color to it in any way. So for all practical purposes, there's really nothing much to change. The last thing we want to look at is that over here on the histogram, we can see some of the white pixels are still going. In other words, they should come down and end right here at the right hand corner. So some of them are going to the right hand side, and sometimes this happens on the left too. That's called clipping. And we have a control on here that will let us highlight the areas that are clipped in red. And you can see the clipping didn't really mess up the picture a whole lot. So I'm good with this one. Let's move to the next one. Okay, so we look at this one. The histogram has the colors quite well balanced. It appears as if the red colors are a little bit overexposed, and that can sometimes happen in an image. So I'm going to begin by taking the exposure control, and I'm going to reduce the exposure just a little bit to see if that helps. Now, if you're looking at this picture, what would you say is the center of interest? What part of it captures your eye more than any other part? It's hard to say. Different people have different opinions. I tend to be drawn to this one right here in the center because of the contrast. It's like a bullseye for me. So this is a kind of photograph we would call a texture. It's a feeling shot, and it's not meant to necessarily have one place that captures your eye. Actually, the longer I look at it, I tend to pick up this picture up here in the top. So what are some things that I think I might want to change on this? Well, the first thing I'm going to do is pick on something called clarity. It's kind of a change in a bunch of stuff all at once. It changes the color saturation, the contrast. It's something that's very often used. I'm going to take this clarity and I'm going to move it up and see what it does to my contrast. And what it seems to do is make my color sharper. I like that. Next, I'm going to play with the saturation, which is the color, and see what happens when I turn it up. Nope, don't like that. Going to keep it down where it was. Then the last thing that I very often do, and some photographers will argue whether this is an okay idea, but I like to use vignetting. Now this is vignetting. Just look at the picture and see what happens when I apply it. Okay, vignetting darkens the corners. And as I darken the corners on this, it makes my eye more attracted to the center of interest. I've still got the background stuff. So the vignetting control has a lot of characteristics to it. Amount is what you usually mess with. There's a thing called midpoint, which decides where it's going to be. And the most important one is actually feathering. Feathering then makes how fast this particular thing happens. Put it down on maximum and you got like an oval around the outside. As you put it up here on a higher number, it begins to start on the outside and work its way on in. So in this case, I think that's what I want to do for this picture. Okay, next picture. Great flower. Interesting composition. Composition has the center of interest down here on the flower, and it's more or less a third. There's one third line, there's another third line. So now you have to decide whether this background stuff really added to the picture. It's a tall, skinny picture, so if you're going to put this in a frame, you're going to have a hard time. So because I do a lot of work for photo studios, and the photo studios are putting pictures as 5x7s or 8x10s, I've just gotten in the habit of cropping to those sizes. And when I click the cropping tool, it's nice. It gives me some grids on here to see where my third lines are. So I'm going to crop this down to an 8x10 format and see what happens. Okay, there's the 8x10. As we align the flower in it, that's probably more like what my eye wanted to see. That extra stretch didn't help any. So I cropped the picture for here, and already we've gotten rid of some of the annoying stuff in the background. Let's look to see down here whether there's anything that was washed out, and not much. A couple of white parts of the flower. I'm okay with that. Exposure is great. As we look at this, now there are some areas over here on the left-hand side where there's a lot of it, but that's the shadowy part of the picture. And the whole thing's kind of mellow. What we don't want to see is clipping, where this edge over here would work its way off, or this edge over here would work its way off. So far I'm pretty good with all those things on the picture. I like to play with clarity, so let's see what happens if I move up clarity. Nah, didn't like that. How about color saturation? If I up the color saturation. Actually, I kind of like that. I'm going to pop it up just a little bit. The vignetting. Is the vignetting going to add anything to my picture? Now we flow it down and I think, okay, I like the vignetting on this because the center of interest is really the center of that flower. And so this gives you the other parts, but it darkens the background, sets it apart. I like this one. Okay, now we look at another picture. Again, we go back to the histogram. You're looking for where the bulk of the pixels fall. Remember, this is the dark side. This is the light side. And what you notice is a big bump over here on the right-hand side. This is the center, so if most of your image is on the right-hand side, it means this picture is just a teensy bit overexposed. Let's go down here, go down here to the bottom and see if any of this is burned out. Nope, turn that on, nothing shows up. So none of it's been washed out or totally cut off. So as I look at the picture, the center of interest is obviously the berries or whatever these things are. And they're placed according to the rule of thirds. Interesting photograph. Let's see if there's anything that we can do on it that would make it any different. Let's begin by changing the exposure and cutting it down. Perhaps a little bit of a cut is good. I'm going to take the clarity and play with that and move it up. I think I'm just going to leave that alone. Saturation. Is there any reason to up it? No, not really. And then final, what I play with is the vignette. Does the vignette add anything? Now I think I like the vignette again on this one because it darkens the background and tends to focus your eye more on what your subject is supposed to be. I'm going to feather it a little so it comes in gradually. And there we are. Next picture. Okay, gotta love people pictures. The photographer has placed the eyes over here on the 1/3 line. Let's click on the crop so we can see where those lines are. So her eyes, her face are mostly located particularly along the top 1/3 line and over here on the left-hand side. I like that. That's good. Looking at the histogram, it looks like the colors are pretty good. So all in all, a picture that immediately attracts your attention. The background being blurry is great because you kind of need that. If it was sharp and clear, it would distract from the person's face. So is there anything we would change? Well, I think the exposure is perfect. There's nothing really messed up on that. If we take clarity, does it make a difference? A little bit sharper on her hair, so I'm going to keep it at that. Saturation, probably not. Is there any reason to vignette it? I kind of like the vignette a little bit. In fact, quite often in my pictures, I use the vignette because it forces us to look more at the center of interest. Next one, we got our desert flower scene. This one is fairly well exposed, but a little bit clipping on the right-hand side on the highlights. The center of interest on this one is not totally dominant. It's this, I suppose, is the center of interest, the flower part. But because of the activity that's going on in the back of it, my eye tends to bounce back and forth between it. And so it's not a real strong attraction as far as the picture is concerned. Let's see what happens if we change the exposure. I like changing the exposure a little bit because it makes the clouds better. How about clarity? Move up clarity. That helps a little. Now we've got some sharp separations. And let's go back now and try the vignetting. Well, in this case, the picture has just got too much going on in the background for me to be totally excited about it. It's got a nice story that it's telling, but there's just something that I would change on it, and I'm not quite sure what. Okay, now we have a nice landscape pictures. So landscape pictures have kind of a whole set of rules of their own. Landscape pictures quite often don't have a dominant center of interest, but in this particular case, we do. As you look at this picture, you're going to see that there's just one part of the landscape, that the great house that's in there, that attracts you the most. As I look at it, I'm thinking, I'm not sure if the white balance is great on this. So I'm going to go to the white balance control and click on auto. I think that's probably more like what the colors were supposed to be. So I'm going to leave it at that. And sometimes white balance can make an incredibly big difference in what we're doing. Putting your camera on auto white balance doesn't automatically get you great white balance. Again, as I'm looking this, there's a lot of it that's overexposed. Let's see what we get from the thing. Mostly clouds. That's not a big deal. So I want to look at it and see what happens if I change the exposure. Okay, I like changing it just a little bit like this. It darkens up everything and brings the histogram more back into line. Is there anything I want to change on clarity? Yeah, as I change the clarity, see how it just kind of makes it crisper. Saturation, it's already quite well saturated. In fact, if we go way up here, it becomes kind of psychedelic. So I'm going to put it down to actually a little bit less than normal, so it's not quite so dominant. Is there any reason to have a vignette? Almost always find a good reason for a vignette, because it holds your eye in the center of the picture. Okay, do you have any trouble figuring out where your eye goes on this one? Oh, let me go back to the last one for a second. It's important to make sure that your pictures are going to fit a frame. So let's take this one and look to 8x10, which is the typical size. And as we look at that and crop that, I think, well, yeah, is there anything that we want to change? I'm going to go through this, put my house more obvious on this rule of thirds, and make that little bit of a crop. I kind of like that one because it makes it more obvious that that's my center. Okay, so now back to the eagle. Again, looking at this, a pretty good chunk of the pixels are over on the right side, and that's because of all this white stuff that's in the background. Is there anything in this picture that's distracting? And I think, well, actually, my eye's kind of attracted to the things in the background. So it's a good candidate for cropping. So I'm going to click a standard size. Let's do 8x10. And I'm going to crop it down. And what I want to make sure is that my bird is over on the third line, because the beak and the eye are what you're attracted to. We still want to have it coming in a diagonal line from one to the other, so we crop this. And I think I like that one a little bit better. The exposure, let's underexpose it a little bit, and I'm going to move the clarity up. And as I do, the contrast changes, and the beak begins to pop out a little more. Saturation, do I want to move it up? I'm going to move it up just a little bit to make the beak look great. And then back to my old buddy, the vignette. Do I want a vignette? Yes, I want a vignette. So I can force the viewer's eyes more into the eye of the bird. Next one. Okay, obvious center of interest, place on the rule of thirds. Let's look at the cropping thing and see where it is. Yeah, pretty much on it. An unusual size for putting in a frame. If you were to put this in a standard size or proportion of frame, you might have a bit of a hard time. Let's see what some of our choices are. If we put it on 8x10, well, it's still a great picture on the 8x10. In fact, let's just crop it for that and see how we still like it. Is anything cut off? So we look here, there's a couple of places on the picture where the pixels have oversaturated, but I'm okay with that. Does exposure need to go down? Let's look at and try an auto exposure. Didn't make any change at all. Let's cut the exposure down a little bit, and you can play around with this and see the changes that it makes in the subject. I'm going to kind of tend to keep it down here because it makes the cross and things that are on the boots jump out a tad bit more. Down to my buddy the vignette. I'm going to vignette it a little bit, and I'm good with that one. Now here's a photograph that, as you're looking at it, what is this? This is a reflection that's in the water. But when you first look at it, you're, okay, we've got some rocks. We've got some rocks up here that seem to be washed out or cut off. So let's hit the saturation right. Bunch of stuff that's red like that. You want to try to avoid that. As we look at the histogram, we can see that it's shifted quite a bit to the right, particularly in the blue category of pictures. So it might mean that we have to make a color shift to it. So let's go back to our choices for color shift. And let's begin by taking the color and the custom, the white balance, and going from the lost shot to custom balance. Whoa, that's probably more what the colors were like, but now the exposure is way far off. Let's cut it back. Okay, it's brought us down more to being able to see what's going on up here in the top. Again, let's look at clarity. What does clarity do to this picture? Sharpens it. Saturation, do we want to saturate? No. Our buddy the vignette? Perhaps. It'll at least pull us more into which is what the center of interest is, which is the reflection of the tree here in the water. So it's the rocks up here that bother me the most, because your eye is attracted to things that are very bright, and your eye just can't go away from it, or at least mine can't. So I'm going to look at my cropping tool and see what happens if I put this into an 8x10 format. Let's even pick the 5x7 format. Much better. So now as I look at this, can I arrange my center of interest so that it's flowing down the third line and crop it off? Does that help? I think it does, because the white rocks that are up in the top, again, were attracting my eye. And I'm good with this one. Next one, snow. Snow can be a problem. Let's see if any of it is clipped. Actually, less than I would have thought. Great picture, typical of photographs that are done today with backlighting. Over here we have the flare that comes on it. Some people don't like that. So I'm going to look and see whether auto exposure makes a difference. Not really. I could hardly even see the change. Will underexposing make a difference? Actually, I'm going to kind of keep it here at slightly underexposed. It brings the texture of the whites out, and I still have the nice great stuff for the horse. Clicking on clarity. No. Saturation. I'm going to keep that the same. This is probably not a good vignette candidate, but let's see. Well, if you want to cut down on the flare, then this would be a good thing to do. I'm going to cut it down a little bit, because actually I'm kind of an old guy, and the flare stuff just is in my book of oops things that I learned. So I'll leave this one at that. Bye. Next one, good old sunset. Again, we're looking at the exposure. It seems okay. It's typical for what a sunset will look like. So is there anything we want to change on it? Well, first I'm going to check my white balance and see if there's anything different. No, undo that. That one probably is correct. Okay, exposure. What happens if I cut the exposure down? You can do a lot of different things with it. As you cut it down, it brings you more into the sun. As you bring it up, it makes the sun faded. So I'm going to leave it right about there, so we got a little bit of both. Do I want to mess around with any of my other portions of the picture? And so we're looking at this. What happens if I take the highlights and I brighten them up? I'm going to leave that a little bit brightened. What about my whites as we cut those down? No. The blacks. Do I want to cut the blacks down? Okay, the blacks kind of make the waves darker, and I like that one. But again, it's a matter of taste. Clarity, a little bit. Saturation, probably not. Everything went psychedelic on us. And vignette, Probably not, but we can take a look. Nope, gonna leave the vignetting off. So the last thing we have is the horizon line. You always want to make sure the horizon line is straight. And we're going to check to see if this one is. So what we're going to do is go down here to the corner where you can rotate the picture. You see you get a much finer grid. And what we're looking at is the left side of the horizon on the same line. In this case, great, right on, perfect. So the only change that you might make on it is, do you really want to have the center of interest in the center? So let's trim this down to an 8x10 for your wall. Trim it along. Okay, do you like it better that way with a lot of negative space over here and your eye drawn to this one? That's the way I would do it. Okay, the long road to nowhere. Looking at this photograph, again, this is the midpoint, so the majority of the pixels are over here on the right. So this is a tad bit overexposed. So I'm going to go down here to the exposure, and I'm going to cut it down a little bit and darken it up. Okay, I tend to like it better right there. Are any portions of it overdone? The sky, and that's fine because there's no detail that's up there. What about the color? Let's see what happens if we change the color balance. Ooh, that made quite a big difference. I'm going to guess that this is probably more realistic, so we'll leave it at that. Next I'm going to go down to clarity and up the clarity a little bit. What that does is change my contrast, makes the texture stand out. How about saturation? I'm going to up the saturation a little bit so the green is more dominant. How about the vignetting? I'm for sure going to vignette this one to draw you into the center. So now we get down to the composition itself. Ansel Adams used to have a thing called the near-far relationship, where he wanted things that were near to be related to the things that are far. And so the rocks and all that stuff are that way. But when you look at this picture, what becomes the dominant object, which catches your eye right off the bat, is this chunk of rock, this wall that's here. And so what I'm going to ask myself is do I want that? So I'm going to go down to my cropping tool. I'm going to pick one of my standard wall sizes. Let's do an 8x10. And I'm going to pull this down and see what happens if I get rid of the rock. And then do I want to pull the picture to this side or pull the picture to that side? 8x10 doesn't work out as a good proportion. So let's go more for 5x7. Looking around, which way do we want to pull it? Okay, I want to pull us from the right into the left. Crop it off. Do I like that picture better? I personally do. It pushes us more into looking at what's going on in the depth of the picture. One more chance at looking at the vignetting. Okay, that's the way I'm going to leave that one. Okay, close up, flower, great framing, that sort of thing. Obvious center of interest, which is the only real actual object you can see in here. Again, looking at the pixels, they're mostly off to the right, so it means that this picture is overexposed. So we're going to pull the exposure back down, bring more of the wall back in, less of the background stuff. Flower becomes more dominant. I think I like that better personally. I'm going to click on clarity, up that a little bit, and it just kind of crisps stuff. Do I want a vignette? Yes, still keeps the texture, moves me more to the flower. And then finally, what about cropping? What size do we want on this picture? Let's go by the 5x7 format. How much of it do I really want to have? So I'm adjusting it to put my flower down in the lower third. So I'm going to leave this one at that. A horse in the sun. Looks like the photographer's already vignetted this one. We look at the histogram and it's all over everywhere, but it's great. If anything, I'm going to say that the blue is shifted a little bit. So I'm going to come down here to my color tints and try changing it to be a little bit more blue. Blue is colder. This is brighter or warmer. This is where it was. So I'm going to up the blue just a little bit. This part of the picture right here is a little bit washed out. So I'm going to see what happens when we take the exposure and we cut it down. So that's really the highlight of what we're looking at in this picture, is the horse's face. So as I darken this up, it's getting us more into seeing what's going on in the horse's face. Are there particular colors that I want to upgrade? Yeah, let's take a look and upgrade the whites. Nope, too much. How about the highlights? Okay, that helps a little. The shadows, do I want to darken them? Clarity, do I want to up it a little? And there we are. I'm good with this one. Okay, getting down towards the end here. Another snow picture. We've got some clipping. That does happen with snow, but it's not really too bad. Exposure, let's see what happens if we change the exposure on this. I kind of like that as it brings down the snow. In fact, when we go way, way down here, the snow becomes dominant and the shadows not so much. So I'm going to leave it right in there. I'm going to go down to my adjustment for whites and try adjusting that down. I'm going to take my highlights and pop them up. I'm going to take clarity and up it a little. And then let's see what happens with our buddy vignette. Forces you more into the bridge, keeps you from wandering down here. I'm good with that one. Okay, here's our last picture. Unfortunately, this one's just way out of focus. And that happens on close-up pictures. So for a final exam picture, I would probably eliminate this one from my collection and see if I had one in the set that was a little bit better focused. Again, there's some cropping over here on the right-hand side of the highlights. Quite a bit of it is clipped, and that's okay. Center of interest, 1/3. Let's see how that fits when we look at the cropping. That's pretty much exactly on the center of the top 1/3. So nothing much to change on that. Will exposure make a difference? Probably not. Clarity, I'm going to up it a little. Saturation, I don't think so. No, saturation is just right. And the vignette, let's see if that does anything. Always kind of keeps your eye into the center. So there we go. There's a little bit of each one of them. Now we look back at the resulting changes that are on here of our whole group. And again, you decide, are there particular ones that attract your eye more than another? If you were a judge in a photo contest to decide which one is going to get the blue ribbon, which one would you do?